Okay, hello and welcome everyone to today's Norms and Behavioral Change Talk, which is hosted by the Center of Social Norms for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Alex Spanev. I'm a senior data research scientist at the center, and I'll take us through a quick intro for today's session, after which we'll hand it over to today's two speakers. Um, so you can see the timeline for today's talk. We'll be done with the main portion of the talk by about 2 p.m. and then we'll have a Q&A. Today we'll start with a brief talk by an early career researcher, Sili Zhang, uh, and then it will be followed by the main talk by Dr. Gregg Sparkman. Um, After these talks, again, we'll have a Q&A segment open to all participants, where you'll be able to ask questions by either raising your hand gesture in Zoom or posting a question in the chat box. Uh, for everyone who might be new to the series, the NoBeC talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. And we have those talks about once a month. So here you can see the schedule for the talks that are scheduled for the January and February 2026. And the schedule will be updated as we go on. So if you copy the URL or if you use the QR code, you'll be able to get the info about the center. Recording of NoBeC talks are available on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to rewatch and watch our previous talks in the series. Lastly, before we turn to the speakers, I have just a few requests. You should be automatically muted when admitted to the Zoom call. But if you're not muted, please mute yourself just to not distract the speakers and not to not to introduce any noises to the talk. If possible, keep your camera on so that we can have a more interactive experience. For questions, please use the chat at any time or the raise hand button at the end. And again, the recordings of the sessions will be uploaded to our website. Okay, and our first presentation today is by Dr. Sili Zhang. Dr. Sili Zhang is assistant professor of economics at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. She is a behavioral economist working on topics at the intersection of economics and psychology, using a combination of applied theory, experimental methods, and surveys. And her research focuses on how perceptions, narratives, and values shape individual beliefs and economic behaviors. And she will give her talk on time and state and commitment. And without further ado, I'm gonna give the floor to Dr. Sili Zhang. And you are muted, Sili, right now, so you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, very good. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot for the introduction and thanks for having me. I'm a behavioral economist, and this is a joint work together with Lorenzo Casaburi and Jack Willis. Both are development economists who are doing a lot of heavy lifting of the field part of this project. So the starting point of this one is the observation that many economic decisions are actually state dependent. You can think about saving consumption decisions, which are influenced by income fluctuation. Could also think about health decisions, which obviously depends on the health status. So traditionally, the presence of the shocks, the presence of the state dependence actually motivates the preference for flexibility. And that is basically the option value of waiting, because it's always better to wait until the information kind of reveals such that you can make optimal decision, which depends on the realized state of the world. So in this paper, we're going to make a case for the following mechanism, which is people actually may find future state dependence undesirable. So you can think about internal conflicts of perspectives, which is if you let your future self to make a decision, maybe your future self is going to make a decision that you don't like today. And if that is the case, actually, that's a reason for commitment. If you anticipate such undesirable future state dependence, actually, the very presence of the state would be a reason for demand for commitment. So what we did is essentially try to formalize this logic in a model, and then we provide field evidence from a high-stake experiment in Uganda. And in particular, we're looking at agriculture insurance. So what we did is to run RCT with smallholder farmers in Uganda, where they buy two-season crop insurance. And this is a highly relevant setting for our case because first off, it's high stake and it's super policy relevant because typically farmers suffer from underinsurance. And second, people tend to know that insurance is really highly state dependent. If we just had a disaster, then the demand basically keep increasing. But whenever we have a very good season when there's no payout, then suddenly people start to canceling. So the policy question we're trying to solve is there a way to try to make sure people commit and take up insurance without canceling? So the commitment decision we're looking at in our setting is essentially the decision to buy insurance for 2 seasons and turning down the option to be able to cancel people's insurance after the first season. So it's really the flexibility option that we're talking about. One conceptual point about our setting, which is super nice, so we happen to work with a contract which is called pay-at-harvest insurance. So typical insurance would require payment upfront and all the benefits are in the future. So here you will have the standard beta delta preference or present bias in the sense that people underestimate future benefits, so they don't really take up enough insurance. So pay-at-harvest insurance is a product such that cost and benefits are really postponed at the very end of the season. So as such, present bias or sophistication about present bias will not be a driver of commitment. And that is important because so far that has been one of the predominant drivers in economics. And we're basically ruling them out from the start. Okay, so let's kind of look at the setting just to understand the setup a little bit. So as I said earlier, we're working with the pay-at-harvest insurance, which sort of removes this intertemporal motivation. And it's an index insurance where premiums are really deducted from the farmer's harvest revenue. So how does the contract enforcement works? Well, it's actually combined or interlinked with the output market. So basically all the farmers are in relationship with a contract farming company, and they promise to sell their revenues or their crops towards the end of the season to this company. And then this company now have to handle, basically they're able to deduct the revenue from the very end of the season. And that's how they're able to offer insurance coverage without asking farmers to pay upfront. So here you basically see this timing. As you can see, farmers are making decisions in the first season, and then their payments and their payouts are all going to be delayed in the future. And this helps us to remove a motivation for take-up that is related to temporal reasons. And now what we do is try to extend it to multiple seasons in particular too. And here the farmers are going to decide whether they're going to subscribe for 2 seasons at the very beginning of the first season. And the particular commitment we're looking at would be this decision about, do I want to decline this cancellation option at the very end of the first season, such that I will be able to cancel my coverage for the season 2. So again, back to this kind of motivation, it's always kind of optimal for people to maintain flexibility because you can always decide after seeing how the first season goes about whether to keep this insurance coverage in the second season. So it's really a flexibility option. Okay, so setting, as I mentioned, is in Uganda. We work with the farmers who harvest crops twice per year. And this is a project together with one of the largest crop insurance association together with one of the off-taker. So the timeline is as follows. So the baseline field visits where we randomize all the treatment later, I'll be talking about happens last year in August. And then we'll have the first season being the second season of last year. And then we have midline survey where people are going to make decisions about whether they want to cancel or renew their insurance decision for the second season. And then the second season was basically the season that just finished in the first part of the 2025. And afterwards we have endline survey. Okay, so then just think about farmers' perspective. Essentially, they're going to make a very simple decisions, which is before the first season begin, they're going to decide in person, do I want to take this insurance offer for 2 seasons, yes or no? And condition on being interested in insurance, they're going to decide, do I want to keep the commitment? And this commitment is essentially the possibility for me to be able to cancel or to adjust the coverage for the second season. We also ask the form of the commitment and the reason for commitment. I'm not going to talk about details, but happy to chat afterwards. At this point, you might think about many possible explanations for commitment demand. Maybe you could think about mechanical reasons, and some of them are more or less interesting. So we did a lot of design effort, try to rule them out. But at the end of the day, we're not able to rule out all of the smart explanations you might be thinking about. So instead, we're going to rely on treatment or intervention we're going to discuss next to try to causally identify the role of state dependence that I motivated at the beginning. So for that, let's first look at the conceptual framework just to fix the idea. And here, the conceptual framework is built around this harvest state, which is really playing the central role in farmers' agricultural lives. Okay, so our premise is that while people have insurance, the benefits of the insurance is really depending on the harvest states. It's just more beneficial to have insurance coverage in the bad state than in a good state. And here we're building two types of state dependence. And the first one would be internal conflicts, which is kind of related to the idea of projection bias, which gives you this prediction that maybe people undervalue insurance after a good season. The second type we're building is state-dependent mistakes, or these scarcity-related ideas, which is people actually make worse decisions after financial stress, after scarcity, or after a bad harvest. So here, we're going to be agnostic about the types of the state dependence. And then in the design, we're going to have built-in diagnostics to understand which forces are present. But at the end of the day, the main prediction we have is sophistication about the forces are going to drive commitment for one or two states. And here, the idea is that you anticipate how future state realization is going to influence your demand, then that make you make decisions already today. Okay, so then what is this intervention that we designed try to causally identify the role of sophistication? Well, essentially, our individual level intervention makes people think. What we did is try to go through hypothetical insurance decisions, ask people to imagine what if they had a good harvest, what are they going to do? If they had a bad harvest, what are they going to do? And then we build in some additional awareness blocks and discussion, which is quite balanced in terms of pros and cons. And here we also have manipulation checks questions to build in the treatment channel just to understand via which channel our treatment might have an impact. And here, the particular channel we're interested in would be these normative opinions. Because if people consider state dependence as something totally fine, then our prediction basically says people should demand flexibility, just as in the classical argument. However, only if people find state dependence undesirable, they're going to demand commitment to prevent themselves from making decisions in certain states. Okay, so then let's have a look at the results. The first question is, do farmers demand commitment? So here I'm basically showing you results in a control condition without any intervention, and the big answer is yes. We already find 40% of demand for commitment in a setting without present bias. So farmers want to tie their hands, give up this flexibility, even though present bias is not at play here. Now let's look at the treatment, which is about thinking through state dependence. But first, we want to know through which channels does our treatment actually do. So here we have a bunch of questions, including the channel we're interested in, which is the normative attitudes. Here we do find people consider state dependence very undesirable, and in particular, they consider it more undesirable after our treatment. And then we have a bunch of other channels we had in mind, which might be influenced by the treatment just by coincidence. We are hoping to control all of them, but in the end, we actually don't find many evidence for these other alternative channels. Now, this one would be the headline results of the paper. So when we look at the treatment effects on the commitment demand, we actually find that thinking through state dependence further increases commitment demand by another 11 percentage point, which is consistent with the conceptual framework that we put up with. So there are many things I skipped today, including whether commitment is useful, so on and so forth, but happy to chat afterwards. But I wrap up already quickly. So here I basically provide field evidence on the demand for commitment. And we're providing a specific channel, and this is a demonstration in a high-stakes setting where time preferences do not really matter. So we find high take-up. We also find that commitment actually responds to this treatment, and that is kind of consistent with a channel which is about sophistication, about state dependence, and negative normative view. And here you will have broader takeaways, which means that the lessons you learn here can be applicable to other settings where shocks are present. Okay, so then that's basically I have to talk about today. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. If anyone in the audience has questions, you can place them in the chat box for Celie to respond, and we'll be able to go back to them at the end of the main talk. Thank you so much again. And with that, I'm gonna give the word to our main speaker today, Dr. Gregg Sparkman, assistant professor in psychology at Boston College. Professor Sparkman studies social influence and social change, including research on theory and interventions to address social problems related to the environment, health, and social inequity. He examines motivations to change behavior and how to advocate for change, including the role of social norms, identity, moral and political beliefs, and beliefs about whether change is possible. His research on social influence includes the effects of learning about trends and norms over time and norm misperception. And with that, I'm going to pass the word to Dr. Gregg Sparkman. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction, Alex. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all and see some of you again. Let me get my slides shared. Okay. So today I'll be talking about understanding social influence using sort of a framework I've been referring to as norm networks. So let's get started. So classically in social psychology and related fields, we've seen what I conceptualize mostly as like a one or two norm approach to using norm interventions. Many of these studies will essentially tell people that a prevalence of folks do some behavior that's like desired for the intervention, or that they believe that's good. And with these types of approaches of sharing this information about behavioral prevalence or attitude prevalence in a group, they've been able to increase behaviors like recycling or waste sorting, reducing home energy or water use, improving diet, increasing exercise, increasing vote turnout and vote registration, and changing policy attitudes. So we've seen this, this approach used across a variety of domains with these norm messages. But to me, it feels like this approach is sort of underlined by this idea that, for a given behavior, you could tell people do that behavior, that people approve that behavior, and that's sort of your options at hand, right? And that those norms are sort of isolated in their influence on that person. Let's imagine you're trying to promote someone to ride a bike. And so, the classic work would say, oh yeah, you could tell people that other people approve of riding a bike or that it's really prevalent, and that might be persuasive. But I could also imagine that other related norm perceptions might be important too, right? So maybe the idea that like, hey, people generally think it's important to get good cardio exercise, right? People think it's important to live sustainably. People partake in other behaviors that are conceptually similar, like outdoor rollerblading or jogging or things like that. Or maybe conversely, people might be influenced by the popularity of an alternative to the behavior we're trying to promote, that people prefer something like driving a car. We could imagine then that one's views would sort of exist in a network of norm perceptions that are all exerting some amount of influence on their decision, not merely whether others ride a bike or approve of it, but like a variety of other norm perceptions too that all kind of feel relevant to that choice. And those norm perceptions themselves might be conceptually connected in people's minds. If I think one of these things is prevalent, maybe I think another one of them is prevalent too. So considering that norms may exist in networks like this, I think there's some basic theoretical questions we can ask. One is, how is this sort of set of social perceptions organized exactly? Maybe in people's minds, it's the case that norm perceptions that have seemingly similar content are also presumed to be similarly prevalent, for instance. That might be one way these kind of beliefs are organized in a person's mind. There's also questions like, okay, so if you change one norm perceptions, how exactly does that affect other norm perceptions in that network of beliefs people might hold? And what does this mean for interventions and conformity processes? Is it the case that some norms might be more related to the outcome of interest than others that's being targeted for intervention? Is it the case that from an intervention standpoint, it's useful to know that some of those norms that you might decide to try to intervene on might be just more flexible or more plastic than others, right? And therefore a better target for intervention. So we started this research in the domain of offshore wind energy. We did this for a few reasons. I think it's a domain that I hadn't seen a lot of norm research on in the past. So just as a quick explainer on why we picked this for our particular set of questions. One is that the public might not be super familiar with all the ins and outs of offshore wind energy. And so in scenarios where people are unfamiliar with things, they might lean on norm perceptions more, right? Because they lack firsthand information. It's also a complex and multifaceted issue, right? It affects jobs, it affects the environment, might affect your home energy prices, it might affect your how much you like the landscape, like all kinds of things. So there's probably many potential norms at play, given how multifaceted it is. Also, it's a domain that has potential for a great amount of impact. So in a lot of the net zero and other types of climate plans, there in the United States, for instance, is a huge requirement to get some renewable energy from the Northeast through offshore wind. And then I also feel like studying these types of topics helps correct a certain kind of asymmetry. So in the field of social psychology, a lot of the norm research has investigated individual behaviors, for instance, but I think it's nice to have some research that also investigates, structural change or policy related things too. So I think it helps address that. So in the first study I'm going to share with you, we recruited participants from states in the northeastern coastal region. So they all had some amount of space on the coast here in the northeast of the US. And we provided them with 50 sort of potential norm statements. So it was a wide variety of second order beliefs, and we kind of scouted these out through media discussing offshore wind, through qualitative conversation and interviews with a variety of kinds of stakeholders, including members of the public. That list is shown here. Don't try to read it. That would be crazy. There's a lot of them. Let me break it down for you. So we have a variety of items pertaining to pro-offshore wind renewables, like believing the government should subsidize offshore wind. We had anti-offshore wind renewables, like beliefs that people feel this is a risky technology. Pro-renewable items, people thinking that, pro-non-renewable items, people thinking that non-renewables were actually good forms of energy. Anti-non-renewable items, favoring the contrary. Anti-regulation attitudes, like this should really just be up to people in industry and the government shouldn't do anything or interfere in any way. Perceptions and endorsement of local offshore wind benefits, equivalently the same thing, but for offshore wind costs. Different partisans perceive support for offshore wind, concern for the climate, belief in climate change, concern for nature, some items from the new environmental paradigm. Conversely, some items from the new environmental paradigm saying that humans should have like domain and control over nature. And all of these, we asked participants on a 7-point scale, just asking people how much folks in the Northeast here felt that like almost no one to almost everyone had this belief. Okay, so we asked folks those their perceived prevalence of those 50 statements, and then we asked them some personal policy attitude outcome measures. Those included a pair of items on offshore wind policy. Those correlated a lot, so I'll be treating them as a single item. They were averaged. We also asked people about their willingness to pay more from energy if it came from offshore wind, ranging from no, not at all, to up to 15% more from our utilities. We asked people about their belief that offshore wind would benefit their local region. And we also had this visibility measure where we showed them this image here on the bottom and asked them like, how close to the coast, would be acceptable to you to have offshore wind turbines. This is important because the closer you can build to the coast, the more offshore wind you can build, right? It makes it cheaper and it makes it more abundant if you can build closer, but it's kind of an eyesore. So it's nice to see potential movement on this kind of item too. Okay. So what might a norm network look like? So we used force-directed plots, specifically using a ordinal multidimensional scaling approach. So we're plotting all of these sort of pairwise connections, the correlations between all of these norm perceptions together in one two-dimensional figure here. Let me walk you through the key to help break down what we're seeing. So each circle or each node represents a different norm perception of those 50 that I showed you moments ago. The shading on these lines, or sorry, the shading in the colors of each node represents content categories. These are top down, so we just labeled what the content roughly is about each of those statements, and that's shown over here in the legend. When two nodes are closer to each other, that reflects that they are more connected in the network, and that could be positively or negatively correlated. When they're further apart, it means they were essentially unrelated. They had no correlation whatsoever. Green lines indicate positive correlations, red lines are negative correlations. Thicker lines represent stronger pairwise correlations between the two. And here in these three kind of white circles, these are personal attitudes, those measures I mentioned to you a bit ago. There's one more up here actually for visibility. Okay, so how do we make sense of this? Well, at first blush, I think there's a few things that jumped out to us. One is that here on the left, we see a kind of clustering of a variety of pro-offshore wind or pro-renewable attitudes. So beliefs that non-renewables were bad, concern for nature, beliefs about low offshore wind benefits, having general pro-offshore wind attitudes and pro-renewable attitudes were all kind of commingled on this side of the figure and heavily associated. So again, this means that my perception of how common these beliefs are connected. If I think that one's common, I think this one's common too. On the right, we have a bunch of norm perceptions that appear to be correlated that are kind of anti-offshore wind or anti-renewables. So anti-regulation attitudes, anti-renewables, that we should or maybe can control nature, believing that there's a lot of costs to offshore wind, and having pro-non-renewable attitudes. A couple observations based off of the whole plot is you'll notice that, typically the nodes that are of the same color are in close proximity to each other. So these top-down categories that we picked happen to be well correlated. And this would be different, of course, than if we did like a bottom-up approach, asking from a network standpoint which ones would be considered clusters. But these were the top-down ones. They appear well correlated. That might suggest that the similarity of content could correspond to how people perceive the prevalence of two norms, right? So if I think they have similar content, I might think they're similarly prevalent in the world. And if you look at, say, these personal outcomes, you might think, well, this approach could highlight that there could be a variety of good contenders that you could choose for norm intervention, right? Like these are at least correlated. Maybe they're causally related, right? Maybe they're a good contender to test and see if shifting norm perceptions about these things might shift personal attitudes. And that raises another question, which are some of these things easier to manipulate than others, right? If I have a lot of options, I should pick the ones that would be easier to shift, probably from a norm perception standpoint. Okay, in the second study, we wanted to assess similarity and plasticity following up on some of those questions. Here we recruited a convenience sample from the northeastern United States again. And to assess similarity, we had them do a free sorting task. So we gave them, I believe we gave them 25 at a time rather than all 50 of the norm items I showed you. And we just said, put ones that you find to be similar in the same bucket. And if you think two are different, put them in different buckets. And we had them just sort them into these categories for us. And from that, we get sort of each pairwise set got matched a certain percent of the time for if people believed that statement or that idea was just a similar idea or a similar belief. And so there's a matrix of all of the 50 and how often they were paired with each other. And you can compare that matrix to their matrix from study 1 on the perceived prevalence. So how strong was the correlation between norm 1 and norm 2 that we measured, right? And so here we have these two matrices and we can compare the two. In fact, you can use a Mantel test to say, hey, is there a connection between each point in this matrix? Do they correspond? And we find a pretty strong significant effect here showing that yes, how often they were matched together for having similar content corresponded to how much people perceive those two norms to have the same prevalence. Another way to do this that I find to be kind of transparent for people unfamiliar with the Mantel test is that you can actually vectorize this list, right? Like I can take norm 1 and 2 and that number, and then another vector, norm 1 and 2 over here, and vectorize those two lists all the way down and then just correlate the two, right? Does the match percentage correlate with the correlation of perceived prevalence? And those two things actually correlate fairly strongly at 0.45. So it appears that norms that are seen as having similar content are also seen as similarly prevalent. That can mean a few things. One, it's possible that this is just people being accurate about their social perceptions, right? That these are, in fact, true perceptions of how popular these things are. And it just so happens that out in the world, similar ideas are, in fact, similarly popular, right? That would make sense. And we're picking up on that through these this relationship between perceived similarity and perceived prevalence. Another possibility, of course, is that people probably don't know really all of these norm perceptions in some accurate way, right? They have a really rough sense of how prevalent these beliefs are in the population. And instead, what they're doing is they have some kind of reference points that are informed by one thing or another that they've seen in the world, and they're just filling in the gaps based off of similarity. Hence, if something's similar, I'm going to guess that it's probably equally popular. And that's how that correlation shows up. Moving on to the second point, do we see variation in plasticity? So we assess this in kind of two ways. One was certainty. So we asked people, if you had to guess the percent of people who felt this way, how certain or uncertain would you be in your estimate? Another way we asked this was, would you be willing to revise your opinion? So let's say you read a poll that was different from what your estimate was. Would you update your estimate? Would you revise it? So here we did a subset of the norms, not all 50. We just want to see how much variation there was, essentially. And we see there's quite a bit of variation when people self-report their certainty. There's less variation when people self-report their willingness to revise their estimate, but there still is significant variation. So that's kind of interesting. However, again, as I just said, these are just self-reported measures of plasticity. In the next study, we'll actually be experimentally manipulating some norm perceptions, and we can see, like, do some just seem to actually shift more than others, which is another way to evaluate this question. Okay, so moving on to the third study. So yes, how might norms influence each other in a network? So our first hypothesis was that, well, presumably there's some influence of norms that were directly associated in those networks, right? So if I influence, say, this norm here, and it had a strong association with this other norm, it's probably going to influence that norm quite a bit. And maybe it'll also influence this other norm that it correlated with, but maybe to a lesser extent. And presumably it's not going to have much of an impact on this other norm for which maybe there was no association in that network, right? So the more associated they are, the more we might expect them to change. But it's also possible that there's indirect influence across a network, right? So let's say that this first and third norm don't have any particular association in people's minds and don't have any correlation as we're trying to measure it. But they both are connected by some intermediary norm, right? So it's possible that if the first one influences the perceptions of the second one, that will go on to influence perceptions of the third one, presumably to a much lesser extent than the direct influence would be. And so these hypotheses, right, come pretty straight out of other kind of cognitive networks and research in those spaces. So we recruited a sample from the Northeastern coastal states again, and they saw one of 5 conditions. There was 4 different norm interventions that we had here where people read information based off of the representative data we collected in study 1, letting people know that, for instance, a vast majority, specifically 85%, felt that all things considered offshore wind was a good source of energy. And there was 3 more norm interventions that we picked out of that network, or a control group that essentially received no norm information whatsoever. Then folks reported their norm perceptions for all 50 items, again, the same ones I showed you from study 1. So just a real quick, preliminary question, do those manipulation checks work? When we told people this norm was prevalent, did they at least believe us that that norm was prevalent, right? The one we're directly telling them about. And let's evaluate that versus the control. So yes, all of these, we successfully increased the perceived prevalence of the norm perception we were directly messaging about. And you'll notice that the Cohen's d varies quite a bit from one to the other. It seems like norm perceptions do, in fact, vary in plasticity based off of these data. we don't have a great way here to disentangle all the possible explanations as to why they vary a lot. I'll put forth a couple here just for thinking about it. So the numbers we gave people were higher for some of these than others, but all of them notably were about 30 percentage points higher from what people in the control group estimated. So the amount people could have gone up was still, similarly high for each of these. So I don't think that is necessarily the explanation. It might just be people are more willing to update their perceptions on some of these things than others for other reasons. Okay. So let's test H1. So do we see a case where norms that are more associated with a manipulated norm show greater change in their perceptions as the norm perceptions might spill over in this network? So we used the correlations from study 1 where there's no manipulations as a kind of basis for this. And we essentially constructed a regression where we used what I'll call dosage here. And so that's the idea that we actually took that correlational strength from study 1 and we saw do norm prevalence perceptions update or increase as a function of how strongly they were correlated in that norm network. And then we're nesting that model by people are asked 50 different norms and they are giving repeated measures. So nesting by participant as well in that mixed model. And we find, that this dosage variable that we've kind of constructed here does go up. So, when we update norm perceptions, related norms increase as well as a function of how related their prevalence is perceived to be. So you do see that kind of norm spillover. What about the indirect connections? So again, the idea here is that when two things are not themselves correlated, but significantly relate to an intermediary, influencing this one might end up resulting in shifting this one too. We operationalized this. So we tested this effect among a subset of the data that met the following criteria for what we thought might be reasonable for indirect influence. So one is there could be no correlation, no significant correlation here down to a correlation of 0.15. We try to make it, close to 0. They had to, the first and third one for here, had to have an intermediary correlation that was greater than 0.3, so a decent intermediate correlation. And we also restricted it to cases where manipulating this norm did in fact shift this secondary norm as well. So then the question is, does it go on to shift the third one, basically? So just to kind of map that out on that network I showed you before, let's say we manipulated norm 14, which is one of the ones we did. And we see that it has this direct effect on a norm that it directly correlates with beyond 0.3, let's say norm 19 here. Okay, does that go on then when we manipulate this to also influence this norm out here at 45, which doesn't itself have a correlation with 14, but does correlate with 19 as well? And that's the question. So we tested all of those cases basically to see if those types of norms shift. So we look at all those indirect norms and we see if dummy-coded people in the control versus one of the intervention conditions show movement on those norms that have indirect connections. Again, with random effects for normal participant. And we find a small and just so significant effect. I don't know if I'd hang my hat on a 0.043, but maybe. Now, that was a B of a 0.06. Are we just too sensitive here? Is this going to pick up everything in the network moves a little bit when you say something? So we thought, let's construct a placebo test as a point of contrast to see if that might be the case. So what about these other norms? So norm 18 maybe doesn't have a significant relationship to 19, but it's also in the network, right? We shouldn't really expect anything to happen with this. It lacks that key ingredient of the intermediary norm connection. Well, let's see. No, when you test those placebo norms, you don't get any movement. There's no shift. Okay, well, just to be even more stringent, we set that bar for having no direct connection as a correlation that was not significant and less than 0.15. But someone could argue maybe there's a correlation there. You just can't pick it up, and you're still getting actually an artifact of just a direct connection, even though it's super, super weak, right? Because this is a small effect. So maybe even a super, super weak correlation is enough to get that effect somehow. Very weak connection could do it. Okay, well, let's take all those placebo norms and restrict them to cases that had an equivalent direct connection as small as it was, which, by the way, was on average about 0.07. Very small correlations, direct connections, right? So we constructed a placebo set. We kind of ordered it by which of these had the strongest direct correlations. All of them, of course, still quite small, but we wanted to make sure that number was comparable to the number in the first test I showed you here for the indirect norms. And still no, you still don't get it even when they have comparable direct connections. So it seems like there's something key about having that intermediary norm. Like that has to be there in order to see a shift in the resulting downstream norms too. So it does appear that altering one norm, perception will spread through the network, updating many norms. Okay, so some recaps so far on the basics of this approach. So perceptions of norm prevalence do appear to be conceptually associated, and it seems that it's likely as a function of how similar that norm content is. Altering one norm perception shifts others in that network, both directly and probably indirectly that they're associated with. Norm networks, it seems, can highlight potential intervention targets. You can illustrate which norms are most associated with an outcome, as we did here. And by the way, in study 3, for instance, here's 3 of those norms that we messaged, right? So 14's up here, number 4 is kind of buried, but it's in here, and 42 is right here. And then here are those 3 outcomes. You might be wondering from study 3, like, did those outcomes move, by the way, as you manipulated those norms compared to the control group? Only this last one did, which maybe coincidentally, maybe not, is the one most proximal in the network to those outcomes. Now, I would argue that all 3 of these could have seemed like good candidates for an intervention if you were doing a norm nudge study of some kind, right? You know, all things considered, offshore wind's a good source of energy. That's not a good candidate, right? It seems like that seems like pretty strong face value. But it turned out that statements that people were willing to pay more actually corresponded more to not just pay more, but the other outcomes as well. And we know, again, that norms vary in plasticity. That's another reason to maybe prefer some norms for intervention than others. So a related question then is, okay, so you can identify what might be a promising norm for a norm intervention amongst many. Can you also use this then to take norm interventions and tailor them to populations for whom, you know, different norms might be more influential than others? And that's what I'm going to talk about here in study 4. So, you know, we wanted to know, in this case, what might predict interest in purchasing an energy-efficient air conditioner. We had 2 samples here, one from the United States and one from India, both collected on Qualtrics. And we asked them, I'm going to spare you the long list of norms this time. We asked them about their norm perceptions spanning energy, climate, quality of life, and interest in purchasing energy-efficient appliances, including air conditioners. Here is an image of the norm network of the United States. And over here, number 53, in this case, the item is if people were interested in buying an energy-efficient air conditioner. And what is it associated with in this case of the United States? Well, it's associated with like pro-climate action related norms and general energy-efficient appliance attitudes broadly. That's what it looks to be most associated with in this network. Okay, what about India? Okay, a bit different. So here is where 53 is. Not nearly as associated with the pro-climate action norms in this case. The personal interest in this case is more associated with these consequences of appliance ownership, things like this is good for quality of life, it represents a status symbol, things like that. So here, energy efficiency isn't seen as, perhaps, maybe you could interpret this as norms about like, do we care about climate change or not necessarily what people associate with their personal desire. And instead, it's like, just generally like having an energy efficient air conditioner is probably just having a good air conditioner, right? It's this notion of it being like a more esteemed thing from a quality of life or status standpoint, perhaps. So yeah, it seems like you would pick different types of norm messages, right, going into these contexts based off this type of information. Okay, so yeah, it might help you identify which norms matter most for specific populations. But I want to say too that I think norm networks actually could enable new types of norm interventions altogether that we haven't classically considered. So for instance, you could try to intervene on a broader social narrative rather than just 1 or maybe 2 norms as we've classically done. So one kind of preliminary form of evidence for this idea is if you took a single norm that was verbatim matched with the individual outcome, so other people like this, I like this, right? we saw an R squared of 0.2, right? Carries about a fifth of the variance we see in predicting it. If you use the rest of the norm network as well, not just that one norm matched to the outcome, but everything else in the network, the R squared a little bit more than doubles. So it could be the case that understanding the whole norm network and trying to leverage that, not just one norm, could be more impactful in an intervention. I think also once you start thinking about norm interventions and the influence of norms in a network, you can now kind of compare new types of norm intervention approaches. So for instance, you could, as I've kind of alluded to so far, think like we're going to do like a direct norm intervention where you try to manipulate norms that are in really close proximity to the outcome, things that are presumably most associated with it and perhaps most causally influential on it. But in some contexts, you might think, that could stir reactance, or maybe there's some drawback to doing that approach. Like maybe this norm is just not very plastic. People are not willing to change their opinion about it. So instead, from an intervention standpoint, maybe you want to kind of go upstream in some way, right? And so you try to manipulate broader norms, maybe about broader values that themselves have many connections in the network to either related norms or that outcome, but are just like kind of one layer removed, perhaps, right? There might be some advantage in some context of attempting that approach. And a third approach that's different from both of these is not trying to shift the perceived prevalence of a given norm, but the perceived relevance of a given norm. So let's say you look at a network and you go, okay, here's something that promotes the outcome I want. Here's something that inhibits or is sort of in some way anti the outcome that I want. People think both of these things are really prevalent, but this one is more associated in the network, right? So presumably people go, everyone hates this and they feel this way about it, and that's really influential to them. But there's this other norm people believe is really prevalent, but in their mind, it's not quite very connected to the outcome. So you could try to weaken the link between this norm and the outcome and try to strengthen the connection between this norm and the outcome. So this is not how we typically think about norm interventions. I think the most similar thing this would be is basically like reframing messages where, let's say you're talking about, I don't know, attitudes about the death penalty or something. And you're like, is it a question of justice for victims, or is it a question of should the state be allowed to kill people? And like which criteria people are using to evaluate that, they're repositioning their personal attitude to correspond more with one belief or another belief. And this is kind of like that. You're trying to reposition their attitude to correspond more with one norm than another norm, because you know that norm will be more favorable ultimately to that attitude. Okay. In fact, we do a study where I'm gonna show you our approach at trying all three of these. So here we looked at a different outcome yet than studies we've talked about so far, reducing fish consumption. You might wonder, why do you want to reduce fish consumption? Fish it's good from a health standpoint for the most part, except for some heavy metal concerns. And better than other meats from a climate standpoint. But there's this issue where we are just really overfishing, right? Like some of the estimates I've seen out there say that we've already depleted 2/3 of large fish populations and 1/3 of small fish populations globally, which is wild to me. And so there's this concern that if we keep increasing our demands for fish, that we're just going to collapse the supply of fish, which would result in a lot less food for a lot less people, a lot less jobs for a lot less people, and a lot less fish. Okay, so here we recruited a sample that was quota matched for demographics in the US on prolific. In a prior study to it, we had mapped out a network in order to kind of understand which norms might matter. We included questions about animal welfare, different kinds of value of fish and benefits it has, environmental perceptions, ethical considerations, health considerations, perceptions of how common fish consumption was, and like different policies that might regulate the fish market. And what we did is we looked through those lists and we selected for direct norms that were in very close proximity to the DV and norms that also predicted it in regressions if we try to subject it to like multiple regressions in a more stringent analysis. For upstream, we selected norms that pertain to broader values, like one should consider their health generally in choosing what to eat, for instance, and norms with many connections to more direct norms or the outcome itself. And in Sever Connect, basically we wanted to identify norms that we would be trying to sever what we think might be inhibiting but very proximal norms to the outcome in that network, and try to connect promotional norms. We did this by saying, we've been surveying people about this, and we find that these things actually don't weigh in very much in their choice about this. But these other factors matter a great deal in what they think they should do in this domain. So we just told them, essentially, we implored that some of these things were more relevant or less relevant in the choice based off the prior research we've been doing. And these ones, we just simply told them that these norms were prevalent, like a more traditional norm intervention. Then we asked people about their intentions to change their fish consumption in the near future. They're going to decrease it, they're going to increase it on a scale. And here are the results. The dotted line on 4 here, this is on the scale saying they don't intend to change it at all. At baseline, most people have a vague intention to increase their fish consumption slightly. And we see that gets knocked down a little bit by all 3 of those interventions I just told you about. All those reduce stated intentions at least. We see that effect is largest for the direct norm intervention of the 3 that we attempted. That approach had a stronger effect significantly than upstream and more so than sever and connect. I should stress that that's what we found in this case, but I've already speculated why one might be better than another. And it seems like that could vary from context to context. So I don't know if I always think the direct norm approach is the best approach. I think depending on your situation and the hurdles, you might favor a different one. But in this case, direct won out. And this outcome is just intentions. Let's do a little behavior, of course. So I just wanted to see okay, what kind of a behavioral result does this intervention translate to? What did we really achieve in that sense? So here we recruited another sample. We specifically picked participants from states where they necessarily, if they lived in that state, were going to be pretty darn close to a Panera. So it turns out Panera is really widely distributed, but it's even more distributed in some states than others, such that pretty much every population center has one in a 20-minute drive or something like that. So we picked those states specifically after overlapping those 2 maps to find participants who could make a real choice about a Panera product and it would be meaningful to them because there's a Panera nearby. We compared a control condition from before where they got no information for that direct norm message. And then we told them to select a dish if they win a raffle. So they had to choose in advance, though, which dish they get should they win that raffle. So they're making a choice that might become actualized. And they're also told that you're going to find out which one you got if you win the raffle, right at the end of the survey. And we had it set up so that you would actually find out if you won the raffle before the survey ended, and get a voucher for that specific dish. They had to choose between a tuna salad sandwich and a caprese sandwich. Fish, no fish, vegetarian. Okay, and what do we see? So in this case, this intervention message, the direct norm focused one, resulted in a drop from 37 to 31% of people picking the fish option in this case. So it seems like these things, it's not just moving around, intentions, but also translates to behavioral outcomes. Okay. So some broader implications, I think, of this norm network research and approach. I think this suggests that social lens might be better understood as a network of norms that forms a social reality that's influencing a person, rather than how we've often studied it as 1, maybe 2 norms at a time that feel relevant in a context. I think this type of approach might also be able to bridge cultural psych and social norm research. So could you conceive of a cohesive collection of norms, some broader, some more narrow? Does that provide a meso layer to understand the relationship between, cultural values and very, very micro, specific norm perceptions people have? Does that help you describe the cultural milieu in a way that we haven't been able to do before? And I think it also provides some ways to interrogate and understand norm interventions, including why sometimes they succeed and sometimes why they fail. So I've seen plenty of studies where people have a norm intervention. The norm at face value matters a lot. People might even tell you that it matters for their decision and report social expectations. And there's a manipulation check to confirm, in fact, that they did shift their norm perception, and yet there's no outcome that you might hope for. It's possible in some cases that you see all of these markers of a promising norm message and they still fail. Maybe you did succeed in moving that one perception, but the broader landscape of related norms in that space is still essentially hostile to your intervention. And you're not like tapping into that or aware of it necessarily, right? And maybe you would have to kind of reconfigure people's broader set of norms. So if I persuade you, yes, in fact, people are trying to compost more or something, right? And they care about this. But if you're in a context where you're like, but I still don't think people generally care about climate change or the environment, or people generally don't do these types of things, even if you're telling me they do this one, maybe I believe you, but I still don't feel a great deal of pressure, or I don't feel a lot of influence because that broader set of things still doesn't persuade me too much, right? So norm networks might be able to get at that, help us understand, strengthen, or at least triage norm interventions. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. And right now we are going to move to our Q&A segment. We have about 20 minutes. So first of all, those who want to ask a question, you can raise your hand in the on Zoom, or you can post your question in the chat box. And I guess while we're waiting for the first questions, I'll start. And I have a rather technical question. So can you talk a little bit more about how you constructed those graphs? Because you collect data on the participants, but then your observations are kind of norms and not participants. And then how do you do power analysis for that when you decide how many participants to survey? What goes into that decision?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for the first part, the way it's structured is that you have, multiple norm perception ratings across like 50 items, and you generate a matrix of correlations between those. That matrix of correlational strengths is then converted to a set of dissimilarity scores. That is then fed into a multi-dimensional scaling process that'll force it into 2 dimensions. That, by the way, comes with something called stress. So this is not terribly different from if I were plotting people in a network based off of the frequency of connections they had, right? It's the same, a lot of the same approach underneath is being used. But just to kind of give you a sense of like, what does this mean, or how do I understand this? The best analogy I've come up with to explain this is like, let's say you were in charge of doing the seating for a wedding party, and you understood how much every pair of people liked or disliked each other in your 50 people that are coming to your wedding. And you had to decide how close or far apart everyone's going to be in this 2-dimensional seating space. And like, you don't want it would be great if you could cater to everyone's pairwise preferences exactly. Like this person likes this person, they like this person, but not quite as much. Let's put them slightly closer. But then for the first and second person love each other and they want to be right next to each other, oh, you can't quite accommodate everyone's pairwise preferences perfectly. And that's going to increase the stress at your wedding if you have people who hate each other sitting next to people who love each other or whatever, right? And so stress is actually a measure of, in this case, statistical measure of how well could you fit all that pairwise preferences into a 2-dimensional space. I like the wedding analogy because it makes the stress metric make sense too, to me. Anyways, so that's the first part. How are we mapping it? That's how we map it. There's also multiple kinds of multidimensional scaling approaches. There's like 4 main ones. You look at all 4 of them, you see which one generates the best fit and least stress, and then you pick that one. In our case, ordinal tends to win out for the plots I showed today. I think all of the plots I showed today. And then for power analysis, there's 2 types of things I was showing you. Sometimes I was showing you pairwise contrast of one thing and something else, right? Or a model in a mixed model. And the other was just for the network. How did I decide how to power that? So we did that based off of correlational strength, or rather differences between correlational strengths. So like, let's say I want to be able to discriminate between a correlation of 0.3 and 0.5, and I want to do so reliably. Well, there's a metric you can use for like, oh, can I tell the difference between those 2 correlations reliably, like 80% of the time, right? Am I well powered to find that difference? And so we would often power the network plots based off of like how sensitive we wanted to be able to reliably discriminate between weaker and stronger correlations that might exist. That was usually how we went by our decision to do that. And then for the pairwise contrast, it was, whatever effect size we had estimated and then trying to find something for that. Usually having to simulate it if we're using mixed models, because you can't just pen and paper that. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you so much. So in a way, it's kind of cluster analysis / PCA in like a way to visualize that.
Yeah,
And
PCA, yeah, it's similar. There's some, I think, differences between the reason we liked multidimensional scaling uh, approach of the other ones you could use to plot the cluster is just because like the distances are interpretable. Like if something is twice as far, that like means something than if something was twice as close between two nodes. PCA, the distances aren't quite interpretable, but then the axes are, which is a different perk, but we didn't have meaningful axes we were trying to decipher. So
Yeah.
the distance was really our main thing, which is why we went with MDS.
Okay, thank you so much. And I see quite a few people have questions, so we'll start with Heidi. So if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Greg. It's nice to see you again. And love the topic. I was considering doing something like this, but never got to it in my own research. So I'm glad to see where it's going. I have three. I'll limit it to three because I got a lot of questions, and I'll do them in order of quickness. So, what you had one measure? What is a meta norm that was in your offshore wind?
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, there was sometimes there's questions we bake into stuff that I'm like, I'm curious about something, and like I have a couple slots to spare, and I just want to. So in this case, this is a pet question of mine, which is, are there is there hierarchy among norm beliefs of different kinds, right? Like are some norms broader or dictate other norms? And in this case, I actually wanted to know, are there norms about when you ought to abide by norms? So these would be
okay, yeah.
It's like most people think you should think for yourself on this issue, right? Or most people think it's wise to consider the opinion of others, right? And like I was just kind of curious if that, had any particular function or did anything special in a network, and that was something that I wanted to measure. You can think of cultural psych measures related to tightness and looseness as like being essentially norms about when you should follow norms, right? You can kind of think about it that way, but we just thought we would try something with it. Nothing particularly amazing came out. There's also another hypothesis I didn't share in that research was we had people evaluate how broad or narrow a norm was. Like this norm pertains to a very general idea, like you should always do good things for the climate. And this one's really, really specific, like you should do this one environmental behavior. And we wanted to see if like the directional influence between broad to narrow was bigger than narrow to broad in that network that I showed you, but we didn't see any evidence for that. Like everything just spread. Like people just updated sort of regardless of how broad or narrow the specific thing we intervened on was. And we only did 4 different norms that we tested, but we made sure that they varied in broad or narrow scores people gave us from a prior survey. So it was kind of a limited test of the idea, but we didn't see any evidence for it so far. People kind of had norm perception spillover indiscriminately, as far as we could tell.
That's very interesting. So second question. So about the updating, I might have missed this, but what occurred to me is you're like, why the difference in the Cohen's D? And you had some speculations about that. So had you checked to see if that's related to the strength of the correlation between their certainty about the belief and then their willingness to update that? Because that would seem intuitive to me.
Yeah, I think I believe all 4 of the things we investigated were from that subset that we asked those certainty measures on, but I don't recall, again, it's only 4, so I can't really, I wouldn't do a correlation and be like, oh, that it definitely is, but I don't recall there being an obvious difference. But I might have to go back and check if people could at least self-report that they would be, if that lined up or not.
Sure. Yeah.
But that second measure of I'm willing to update if I saw a poll to the contrary, we essentially tested if that was true, right? And the answers there, the Cohen's D's varied quite a bit more than I would have guessed based off of their self-report if they would be more or less willing.
Okay.
So it seems like we might not be able to tell you necessarily until you actually present them with it, maybe.
Okay, I do have a third one, but I see 2 hands. So if there's time at the end, I'd like to ask it, but I can always follow up with you individually as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Heidi. And the next question is from Diego.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Greg. Very interesting presentation. Two questions. One, my interpretation of several of the statements that were evaluated seem like clear instances of norms, but some I perhaps would say are more attitudes. Some are, perhaps just personal beliefs or values. So have you considered this type of heterogeneity, right? Normative actions, norms in the sense that rules that can guide individual actions versus general attitudes or versus other types of normative beliefs, and how the correlation or the influence between those different type of beliefs that have normative implications may differ.
Yeah,
Does my question make sense?
yeah, I think so. Um, so yes, the perhaps most ecumenical disciplinary phrase I could have used for the talk was second order beliefs, because I don't think anyone would have disagreed with that, maybe. As a psychologist, we see a lot of the same mechanisms for all the stuff I just showed you. So like having it be norm and then adding a different adjective to the front of it, like feels more intuitive, I think, to certain social psychologists, because it's like I can get a lot of the same effects out of these things. I don't know if I'm seeing a ton of differences necessarily. Like a lot of the same mechanisms feel at play. So the overlap stands out more to me than the categories sometimes. And I think the idea that when one updates, they all update, that also should say like, how discrete are these ideas? Like, are they super, super different necessarily? So I think that's part of the reason I tend to use the phrase norm for this wide swath of things. But I think you're 100% right, though, that there can be, and certainly are, like meaningful differences within all of that stuff that I'm calling norms that we could just call second order beliefs too. And we try to get at that slightly with that like kind of hierarchy of broad value to more specific belief. It's just one aspect. And Paul might have thoughts about if there's more spillover from descriptive to injunctive or injunctive to descriptive, given the recent publication you have. But we haven't tested the variety of possibilities there to see how that works. You can speculate that there should be some, at least, right? I mean, just because people do something doesn't mean they love it. But also, when people love something, it doesn't always mean they can do it. So, you know what I mean? Like I can kind of picture contextual factors that would cause more or less, but I don't know if it would be reliably across those categories, if that makes sense. Like it might be that, yes, there's differences, but when those differences dictate more kind of norm updating spillover also is dependent on a bunch of other things too. I don't know if there'd be like rules that are always going to tell you. But I think that remains to be seen. And I think it'd be a fun direction to take this work because, like I said, I do think while there's interesting similarities between these things, and they all, to me, feel like they're in the same world of types of things that can influence each other, I do think the differences are meaningful and would bear a lot of exciting future research. So I haven't done it yet. Someone else should do it. I've seen there's more and more research, not to use dynamic norms. There's more and more research about like the specific phrasing of norms and like what that means to people, right? And I really like where that work is going in terms of trying to understand that. And yet I still maintain that like I feel like there's a lot of thread connecting these things though. Like that's my take personally. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Thank you so much, Diego. And then we have a question from Paul.
Yeah. Hi, Greg. Great talk. Nice to see you again. So, you briefly alluded to it, but like in my work on social norms, right, we find that the kind of behavioral domain of the norm influences the effect of descriptive norms on normative beliefs and behavioral intention. So, for example, right, people are more sensitive to descriptive norms for fairness behaviors than for harm behaviors or personal preferences. So I guess I'm wondering whether that applies in some extent here, right? So in other words, does a specific kind of domain of environmental behavior influence how these norm interventions kind of influence this network of normative beliefs, right? So that is, are normative belief networks differentially influenced kind of depending on whether that normative behavior is like energy conservation versus support for like offshore renewable energy, kind of beyond just differences in normative beliefs already present. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What kinds of things would you be interested in the differences of? So we're in this context, we're in that context. What kinds of questions within that are you thinking of again?
Yeah, so I guess I'm just wondering whether there are differences in maybe like the perceptions of a behavior relating to fairness or harm that can explain kind of differences in these normative belief networks
Yeah.
beyond just kind of existent differences in and other normative beliefs around how popular it is or along those lines? Like, is there something
Yeah.
fundamental to these behaviors that can maybe explain differences across types of behaviors you're interested in studying or different norms?
Yeah. Well, at least for some of the things that we showed, I would suspect that so like the correspondence between like conceptually, I think the thing is similar, and I am also going to guess those two things are similarly prevalent. I imagine that is, for instance, going to be like pretty common across domains. I'm trying to think if there's a scenario where that would be, I guess, scenarios where people had much more firsthand information about norms, like they were like a pollster or something, right? Like then maybe like they wouldn't be doing this based off of similarity, but based off of like true firsthand access to knowledge of norms, right? And then similarly in communities where everyone knows somehow it's more transparent what people think and feel, maybe people aren't filling the gaps as much. And so that kind of similarity to prevalence correspondence drops a bit. This is one example of one of the findings and how I could imagine maybe it could differ across scenarios. In terms of the different kinds of moral domains, well, that kind of finding I think would probably look sort of similar. I do think that it would be interesting to see whether norm updating changes by the types of moral content, like you're saying, because we asked a limited set of questions about when exactly do norms cause other norms to update. And we only broke it down by the things that I shared with you and haven't tried it by anything else. So that I think that would be interesting. The only foray we had was just that one about, like I said, the like broad versus narrow, because that one just felt like very applicable. And we were starting from a place of not knowing a whole lot at all to like, well, what would be some of the first things we would test? But I think those kind of questions would be interesting. You might think that there's sort of like gateway, beliefs when it comes to norm perceptions too, and that could be based off of the content or the domain that it's in. But I think that's yet to be established. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul. And we have a question from Chung. Do you want to unmute yourself and maybe ask the question? But the question's in the chat about dynamic norms interventions.
Oh.
And
Hi, hi. Thanks very much for the talk. It is super interesting. So I want to ask about the potential connection between this work and work on dynamic norms. So one thing I'm super interested in is, so whether you think there's the possibility that, expectations for the durability of trends in adjacent norms would increase or strengthen one's expectations for the durability of the trend in another norm. So the example I'm thinking about is, for example, in terms of meat consumption, right? Is it possible that, for example, a trend in the norm of animal welfare, which is an adjacent norm, would increase or change the expectation of one's perception of the trend in meat consumption? And sorry, that's a long question, and I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that when people see trends in the world, you don't know what's going to happen to that trend, right? I mean, like maybe it's going to last, maybe it's not, maybe it's going to get really universal, but only for a short time and then kind of collapse, right? There's a lot of possibilities, and you might feel a great deal of uncertainty about which one is going to come to pass. But what does ultimately manifest from that trend might matter to you a great deal. And so you could imagine kind of buoying a norm message with like other norms, like helps provide a sense that like this isn't like a random happenstance thing, that there's reasons people are doing this, right? And that's part of what I think is exciting about the approach of not just messaging one norm, but messaging like a whole series of norms together, is that you can start to try to shift whole social realities rather than just a single norm perception that people have. So, if I say more and more people are doing X, okay, whatever that is, okay. If I say more and more people are doing X because they're increasingly concerned about this, they're starting to have more of these experiences in their life where this just becomes more important and necessary. And they're realizing that these things are actually much more enjoyable than they thought, right? Like if you start to put together all these second order things that people are experiencing, saying, feeling, thinking, or doing, it becomes a much like richer narrative. I think it just like has the potential to stay in memory longer. I think you perceive it to like have legs in the world, right? Like maybe it'll keep going, maybe it'll grow. So I think that type of norm intervention construction could be more influential and could strengthen what might be seen as like, I don't know if that trend's going to stick around, in an otherwise hostile social world to that trend. You might be able to, change that perception to an extent, right? And I think that would probably could strengthen a dynamic norm intervention. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you very much for participating in today's NoBeC talk. Thank you, Silly, and thank you, Greg, for compelling presentations and contributions. And thank you, everyone, for your participation and questions. We'll look forward to everyone's participation in the next NoBeC talk in January. And you can see the schedule. So we have a talk on January 2nd, and then the next talk is on February 19th. And until then, thank you, everyone. We look forward to having you join us next time, and have a wonderful winter vacation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'm sorry, Heidi, we didn't have time for your third question.